Now, moving into our fourth perspective that you guys need to familiarize yourselves with. This is the cognitive perspective. So this is the overall argument that the way that we process, then store, and kind of pull up and use information that is brought to our brains, that is what ends up influencing our actions, okay? So the way that we perceive ends up influencing the behaviors that we'll act upon. So any one of you guys could give me an example of how you read a text message from a friend wrong. They said, "What did you do this weekend?" But the way that you read it made it sound like they had an attitude, like, "What did you do this weekend?" And so as a result, that ended up influencing the way that you responded back, the actions that you took in that situation. Maybe you have a crush on someone and that person sees you in the hall and they say hi. So you take that information in and you say to yourself, "Oh my gosh, they said hi." And that ends up influencing your actions toward that person later on. Maybe as a result, you end up feeling a little bit more confident around them, so you tweet them pictures, or you do something along those lines where you Instagram a picture with them or something like that, where you feel like you are a lot more comfortable around them purely based off of the way that you took the whole experience with them into account. Okay, so cognitive is just a fancy word for thinking. That's all that it is. And so as a result of that, what we need to look at within this perspective is just how we take in information, take in experiences that we have, and how that can end up influencing the behaviors for things. So many of you guys could talk about, within this example, your interpretations of me initially speaking from the first day of class. You processed everything that was being sent to you from me in terms of my personality, how I run the class, things that we're going to be talking about. And so based off of that, you made judgments as to how you felt you could behave in here. Many of you guys have felt really comfortable sharing personal experiences. You've talked a lot. Okay, others of you haven't felt so engaged necessarily, and you just sit there and you stare at me like this from your desk. So the way that we take things in, the way that we think about things influences our behavior. So what can cause problems for us then is that we can kind of take things out of context. False perceptions end up causing problems for us, just like I said with those text message examples from earlier, okay? Or tweeting. You can't read emotion from tweeting necessarily unless a person puts an exclamation point next to it, or a smiley face or a frowny face, okay? You don't have if you don't have emoticons there, it's not going to be really easy for you to understand what a person's tone is when they're presenting something to you in a tweet or a text. So false perceptions can end up causing problems for you down the road. But the other thing to keep in mind within this cognitive perspective is something called self-talk, okay? These are the conversations that you have with yourself in your head. We all do it. We all talk to ourselves at some point, okay? Even if we're not willing to acknowledge it. We don't always talk out loud to ourselves, but we do talk to ourselves. For athletes, they call it psyching you up. It's getting in your head and thinking, all right, I've got to get in, I got to get really into things. I'm about to go play football. I've got a really big game. I've got a really big soccer game. I've got a really big lacrosse game. I've got a really big basketball game. Okay, when you sit there and you're in that moment and you're trying to get yourself really energized for that game, you're talking to yourself in your head. Okay, you're using emotions to facilitate and further your actions, because the way that you're thinking about that situation leads to your behavior on the field or on the court. Okay, so self-talk is always present, and it ends up influencing our actions in ways that we don't necessarily think that it will. A fifth perspective to discuss is biological psychology. Your book references it as biopsychological, okay? Really what we're emphasizing within this perspective is that bodily events end up having an influence on our actions and our thoughts and our emotions, okay? This can be anything from physical problems, medical conditions, hormones, brain functions, neurotransmitters, your nervous system, brain disorders in general, anything that is physiologically going on with you, even your genes, end up having influence on a person's actions. So you can't understand why a person acts the way that they do unless you can understand what's going on with them physically. So let's talk nervous system as one of these examples in here. When you are in a stressful situation, your body responds to that, physiologically speaking. We call it the fight or flight response. Your adrenaline kicks in. Your blood pressure starts to go up. Your heart rate starts to go up. Your breathing rate starts to go up. And your body responds by shutting down certain processes. So when you are in that situation, it influences your behavior. If you are in the middle of a really tough test and you're feeling very overwhelmed by that and you feel yourself starting to become stressed from it, that's the physical influencing your actions. That's something going on with you bodily speaking that ends up leading to certain behaviors. If you look at brain functions, physiologically speaking, each part of your brain is responsible for something different. We've talked about how your cerebellum, it's right back here where your spine meets your skull, how that influences your ability to have balance and coordinated movement. So if you had a serious brain injury to the back of your brain, more than likely your cerebellum could be impacted in your ability to have decent balance and coordination, and muscle movement could be heavily impacted. Hormones matter too. You've heard me reference this, but there are research studies out there to indicate that men have, so to speak, a PMS, essentially, very similar to women. At certain times of the month, you have certain amounts of hormones in your body that end up altering your behavior. They make you more agitated, more moody, more emotional. So as a result of those hormones physically flowing through you, they end up impacting your actions. One thing to keep in mind within the biological approach is something called evolutionary psychology. This looks at the function and purpose of behavior, specifically with genes. Why it is that certain genes get passed down from generation to generation to generation, and others don't seem to be necessarily. So for example, why is it that right-handedness seems to be the dominant genetic variation for the vast majority of people and not left-handedness? So why is it that left-handedness didn't get passed down from generation to generation more than right-handedness? Okay, so this is what we're looking at when we take a look at the evolutionary component of psych. We're looking at the purpose behind why some actions or genetic pieces that lead to certain behaviors end up getting genetically passed down. We've discussed together with one another how there are certain mental disorders that tend to lend themselves to evidence that shows they're genetically linked, so they seem to run in families. We talked about how depression is one, schizophrenia is one. We've talked about how some anxiety disorders can be, like obsessive compulsive disorder, for example. So in these instances, why are those genes passed down? What is the purpose of those abnormal behaviors? Why do they get presented to future generations? So this is another component of biological psychology that you definitely want to keep in mind. Now the final thing that we need to discuss with one another is the sociocultural perspective. This one's pretty involved because their overall argument is you can't understand why a person is the way that they are and why they act the way that they do without understanding three key components. You need to look at their culture, their ethnic identity, and their gender identity, in addition to other sociocultural factors. So this argument bases their assertion on behavior and mental processes, that personality and attitudes and skills that we all have, we learn those from others. So when we look at these components, the first one we've got to take a look at is culture. This is a pattern of behavior or beliefs or values that end up being shared by a group of people. So language and superstitions and moral beliefs and food preferences, these are all part of culture. So let's look at food preferences. Some of you guys might be a little too young to remember the show Fear Factor, but one of the big things about that show was requiring people to eat foods that just really within American culture are not pleasant sounding foods, like eating scorpion or other kinds of animal parts like cow intestine or something that we would perceive as being pretty gross. Many of you guys might even be kind of squinching your head face right now like, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. But when you go to other cultures, it may be normal for them with regard to certain food preferences. In China, for example, or in many other Asian cultures, it's not out of the ordinary for them to eat food that we would perceive to be kind of unpleasant and out of the ordinary, like octopus. Or in some situations, there are just other parts of animals that they will incorporate into food that we in America would never think about touching. Superstitions are kind of a cultural component as well. Okay, many of those get handed down within families for things, and they don't necessarily repeat with one another within different cultures. How we perceive normal actions get passed down from culture to culture as well. You've heard me reference this before. The Wadabi tribe in Africa, when men want to let women know they are interested in them and would basically like to date them, they paint their faces bright colors. They go out into kind of a very populated area with a lot of people in it, and they do a dance. But if that were to happen here in the United States, if a guy were to walk up to a girl here at Oak Hills, and while she's in the Commons eating lunch, have their face painted and do a dance for them, more than likely we would perceive that as strange and odd and abnormal. So culture matters when we look at actions and our abilities to explain them. Second thing to look at is ethnic identity. This is each person's sense of belonging to a specific kind of ethnic group. Okay, these are people that you have descended from in terms of a common ancestral component. So for me, my background is based off of my last name, Ruhlman. I'm very German, and many of us in Cincinnati have some level of German heritage. For whatever reason, back in the 1800s, many Germans decided to, when they immigrated to the United States, they settled in Cincinnati. And it was basically from word of mouth, essentially. Family members would write home to their loved ones or friends in Germany and say that they had settled in Cincinnati and they had been able to find work and that other people should come. And so that kind of influenced and encouraged a wave of migration to come to Cincinnati and to have a very strong German ethnic identity here in Cincinnati. So one of the things that we have here is Oktoberfest. It's a very big kind of celebration that we have, and we have them all over the place here. There are so many different areas in town that have it. And just to prove how pervasive German culture has made its way into kind of the Cincinnati identity is over the Rhine. Now, the way that we perceive over the Rhine right now in our modern time is not the way that it was established back when the Germans came here. It was named over the Rhine by the Germans that lived there because their view of the Ohio River looked so identical to them being back home in Germany on the Rhine River there. So that's how that area of Cincinnati ended up developing the term over the Rhine. So that's what we're talking about when we say ethnic identity matters to be able to explain behaviors. One of the things that you're often going to find for Cincinnati people here when they talk, if they can't hear you, they'll say please after you say something. That is directly from German influence. If you go outside of Cincinnati and you meet someone who's interacted with people from Cincinnati, they'll be able to recognize you're from this city purely based off of that statement. Because if you go outside of the city, most people don't use that in terms of the way that they speak. So that's how ethnic identity has influenced us pretty heavily here in Cincinnati. Final thing to look at is gender identity. Your view of yourself as male or female very heavily influences your actions. And one of the greatest ways to kind of emphasize this to you guys as we talk within the field of psychology is the issue of sexuality and the influence that plays on a person's behavior. Many of you are familiar with the concept of being in the closet when it comes to one's sexual preferences. We call that being in the closet. We reference that term to be what it is because a person doesn't feel that they can act on certain actions that society deems as unacceptable or abnormal or outside of what we deem to be okay. And so as a result, you have those actions being influenced by gender identity. But it's not even just in terms of sexuality. If you look at how you act based off of how you identify yourself as girl or boy, girls, traditionally speaking, they wear makeup for the most part. They are, if we're going based off of stereotypical assessments, more interested in fashion. They have a tendency to operate more on their emotions. And so that is how we identify ourselves in terms of our gender and the actions we'll carry in line with afterward. For men, if we're going based off of traditional stereotypes, men have a tendency to be typically more active and more aggressive. They are traditionally more inclined to hold their emotions or keep them to themselves. And as a result, that ends up influencing their behaviors. So within all of this, it's important to recognize for socioculturalists, you don't want to misuse this information. You heard me referencing traditional stereotypical assessments of certain actions, and we're going to talk about that as we move through and get into social psychology further in the year. Socioculturalists don't want you to use stereotypes, okay? Not every person fits into a group exactly. You could place me into a stereotype of being a blonde purely based off my hair. And there's a stereotype based off of that blondes are unintelligent and they lack certain aspects of common sense. That doesn't necessarily fit where I'm concerned. I'm not a natural blonde. I dye my hair this color. So based off of that, I don't fit into the traditional stereotype of typical blondes. So what socioculturalists want us to emphasize to kind of wrap all of this up is that differences are differences. They don't make us inferior or superior to others. They're simply just something that makes us unique. And so as a psychological study, as an attempt to understand human behavior and actions and thought processes, we need to keep that in mind and not place stereotypes on other people as a result. So I've talked way too much in all of this. I'm going to wrap things up for you guys here. We're going to be able to get together with one another to talk about all of this stuff and work through some personal examples so that way you can kind of gain a better understanding of everything. But definitely let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll see you in a little while.